Venice. The submerged truth about our origins. Feel it. That feeling that appears somewhere in the back of your mind when you look at something that is theoretically beautiful, but your subconscious screams that there is something terribly unnatural about it. We have all fallen victim to the greatest fraud in the history of modern civilization. From the moment as children, we opened a history textbook and a carefully scripted fairy tale was forced into our heads. We were shown colorful postcards, romantic shots of gondoliers in striped uniforms and sunsets over the lagoon. We were told, look, this is the triumph of the human spirit, this is Venice, the pearl of the Adriatic. But no one, absolutely no official authority, told us the truth. Venice is not a city. This is not the romantic capital of lovers. This is a crime scene. This is a gigantic, stone piece of evidence in the trial against the falsifiers of our history. It is a monument to a gigantic, brazen, and cynical engineering lie, the scale of which is so shocking that the human mind instinctively rejects facts so as not to destroy its secure image of the world. But today we will destroy this image. We'll peel the plaster off this lie and see what's underneath. Stop for a moment. Turn off your emotions. Turn off the delight that tourist propaganda has programmed into you. Turn on cold, brutal logic. Look around. You see a stone city. You see millions of tons of marble, granite, basalt, brick and iron. You see palaces the size of mountains, cathedrals, whose domes scratch the sky, squares, columns, keep, and all this unimaginable mass of matter, stands on. What? On a sponge. On the rotten, stinking, a muddy swamp that, under natural conditions, would drag a person up to their waist in a few minutes. Official science. All these titled professors in their comfortable offices look us in the eye and explain with an indulgent smile. It's simple. It's all based on wood. Do you understand that? On wood. We are told that in this dirty, salty, millions of tree trunks were used to make organic soup. And on this primitive raft a civilization was built that lasted for a millennium. Do you really believe this? Isn't your instinct for self-preservation setting off the alarm at this point? Let's put the fairy tales aside and take a calculator. Physics and biology are merciless. They know no mercy for historical dogmas. Historians claim that the larch poles driven into the bottom of the lagoon, they haven't rotted for 1,000 years. They use the magic terms anaerobic environment, mineralization, fossilization. It sounds scientific, right? Reassuring. But every engineer, every biologist, in fact, anyone who has ever dealt with wood in the garden knows that it's nonsense. Wood in water is organic matter. The water in the lagoon is not sterile. It's a living broth. Bacteria, microorganisms, borers, aggressive sea salt. They don't read history books. They eat. They digest. They break down cellulose. But even if for a moment, as a thought experiment, we accept this absurd myth about the eternal larch as true, we are faced with a problem that turns the entire official chronology into dust. The problem of scale. Where did they get so much wood? Let's focus on one building, just one. Basilica of Santa Maria della Salute, Baroque Pearl. Official chronicles and engineering reports state the number without a trace of embarrassment. The foundations of this one church were laid 1,767, in words 156, 657. Oak and larch trunks. Think about this number. This is not an abstraction. This is a forest. To obtain 1,100,000 trunks suitable for construction piles, i.e. straight, thick, healthy trees, giant swaths of forest need to be cut down. Assuming optimistic assumptions, since there are about 300 to 400 adult trees suitable for such use on 1 hectare, a forest covering almost 3,000 hectares had to be razed to the ground just for the Santa Maria Church. This is the area of a small city. Now multiply it. Multiply that by all of Venice, through hundreds of palaces, thousands of tenement houses, dozens of churches, kilometers of quays, hundreds of bridges. Where did this forest grow? Where? Europe at that time was not one big forest from which one could draw endlessly. They tell us that the wood was imported from the Alps, from Slovenia, from Croatia. Great! Now imagine the logistics of the Middle Ages. We are talking about times without combustion engines, no railways, no power hydraulics, no asphalt road. We have muddy roads, ladder carts and animal muscle power. How to transport millions of tons of logs from mountain slopes to the sea? Felling is one thing, but skidding? Transport? One workhorse has its limits. A cart with several tree trunks gets stuck in the mud up to its axles. How many horses are needed? Thousands? Tens of thousands? What to feed them on a trip lasting weeks? Who organized the feeds? Who repaired the wheels? It's not just construction. This is a logistics operation at the level of a modern global corporation, requiring satellite planning and a fleet of trucks. And they tell us that it was done by semi-literate people who were supposedly running away from the barbarians in panic. It doesn't add up. The equation is wrong. Let's move on. Deep into this absurdity. Pile driving technology. Have you ever seen a modern construction site in a swampy area? Giant combustion or hydraulic pile drivers are used. The noise is so loud that the windows break. The earth is shaking. And how was it done supposedly in the diastasis or the 12th century? Manually. With a handwoman's hammer. Let's count it. Let's assume the most optimistic scenario. A brigade of strong, well-fed men need at least an hour of hard work to drive one 4-meter stake into the muddy but resisting ground so that it stands vertically and evenly. Back-breaking work. We have 24 hours in a day. Even working like robots, without sleep, no food, no toilet breaks, one team will drive 24 piles. For 1 million people, they are burning under one church. It would take one brigade over 114 years of continuous 114 years just to drive pegs under one building. Of course, you will say, thousands of brigades worked there. Where? What were these thousands of people standing on? On rafts? Where did they live? Where did they sleep? Where did they get their food? Where did they excrete? Venice is a construction site that mathematically could not exist in the time and technological framework given to us. They are trying to convince us that refugees from the Roman Empire, fleeing from the Huns, ran into a swamp and out of boredom, in the break between the fight for survival, they built a marble metropolis there, which stands for 1,000 years. This is a lie. It's a blatant, mocking lie meant to hide something much more terrible. Why isn't anyone asking the fundamental question? Why build in swamps at all? Why create such hellish, unbearable difficulties when there is solid ground 5 kilometers away? Building on water costs dozens, hundreds of times more expensive. It requires technologies that were allegedly unknown at the time. This is economic and strategic suicide. No sensible ruler would waste the resources of the empire on creating an artificial island if he did not have the technology, allowing you to do it quickly and cheaply. What if the piles were always there? Or what if these piles are not just wood? Here we enter territory forbidden by academic science. Recent independent analyses, ones you won't read about on Wikipedia, show a strange structure of the materials that make up the foundations of some buildings. It's not entirely wood and not entirely stone. It resembles geopolymer concrete, an advanced composite that the ancients were able to produce, but whose secret has been lost or deliberately hidden. A material that becomes harder over time in contact with seawater. But the official story sticks to the large version like a drowning man sticks to his lifeline. Why? Because if you consider that the foundation Venice is high-tech artificial stone or the result of the work of a completely different civilization, the entire house of chronology cards will collapse. It would have to be admitted that there was someone smarter, more powerful here before us. Look at old engravings and maps. Venice looks ready in them. There are no images of gigantic construction sites where thousands of people are driving piles. The city just stands there, complete, perfect, as if it had risen to the surface, or as if water had flowed into it. And here we come to the most interesting thing, to a theory that they are afraid to discuss in university departments under the threat of losing their grants. What if Venice wasn't built on water? What if Venice is an antediluvian city? The city that stood on land, but as a result of a global catastrophe, the same biblical flood or Great Mud Flood, the water level rose rapidly and the first floors were underwater? This explains everything. Every absurdity suddenly becomes logical. It explains the lack of forests that no one cut down, explains the lack of millions of slaves with hammers, and explains that damn door. Have you noticed this door? Luxurious stone-carved entrances which are half submerged. Portals that can only be reached by boat, and the threshold is underwater. They tell us this is how it was planned. These are the gondola entrances. Seriously? Main, representative entrance, where the dirty water splashes, where the waves crash against the marble, where the rats and garbage flow. The architects of the past were aestheticians. They knew proportions, comfort, on hygiene. Building a main door leading straight to the sewer is nonsense. This is a sign that the water level has changed. That the city drowned. We look at Venice and see romance, and we should see tragedy. We see the effects of the apocalypse, the consequences of a catastrophe on a planetary scale that was hidden from us by inventing a fairy tale about hardworking Italians and a magical larch tree. This city is a cemetery of a previous era. If you delve into the engineering reports from the 19th Ted Zeka week, when only a few renovations of the foundations were carried out, facts emerge that are completely unimaginable. It turns out that there are no piles under many buildings at all, as they tell us. There are records there. Huge, monolithic stone or concrete slabs whose origin cannot be determined. Who cast them? How were they transported there? Or maybe this whole city was printed. Maybe it's a remnant of the technological base, which we inhabited like wild men inhabiting an abandoned palace. So take a close look at the lower floors of Venetian palaces. You don't need a diploma for this. Eyes are enough. Open any high-resolution photo where you can see the contact between the building and the water. Zoom in. What do you see? You see the windows. Windows with bars. Windows with beautiful frames that half and even completely submerge themselves in the murky green water. You see doorways whose thresholds are constantly washed by waves. They are trying to convince us that this is a brilliant idea of the architects of the past. Supposedly, the Venetians, these great master builders, specially built the first floors so that they were constantly flooded, exposed to moisture and mold. They tell us these are water gates for boats. But every builder, even the most inexperienced builder, knows that water is the main enemy of stone and brick. Capillary rising damp destroys the masonry in just decades. The salt crystallizes in the pores of the brick and bursts it from the inside. Were ancient architects that stupid? Did they design palaces worth a fortune with built-in self-destruct mechanisms? Maybe they knew something we didn't know, or didn't they plan on water there at all? The answer literally lies on the surface. These buildings weren't built on water, were built on land. What we call canals today, these are the old streets. The regular cobblestone roads they walked on, people, carts were driving and horses were galloping. The Grand Canal is not a river, it is wide, the central prospect of the ancient metropolis, the main avenue that was flooded. If we accept this version, all architectural absurdities immediately disappear as if by magic. The ground floor windows become normal windows through which sunlight entered the rooms, not the stinking mud. The doors become normal entrances from the street. Venice is a classic, textbook example of a city that has experienced a catastrophic rise in water levels or a rapid decline of the continental plate. But official history refuses to acknowledge this fact. Why? Because then the textbooks would have to be rewritten. It would be necessary to admit the fact of a global cataclysm that took place quite recently, maybe 300, maybe 500 years ago. The cataclysm that reset humanity. Let's talk about materials and logistics that will make any modern logistics engineer's brain boil. Venice is not only built of brick, but also from Istrian stone. It is a specific, extremely dense and heavy limestone that practically does not absorb water. Perfect material but not found in Venice. It was brought from Istria, from the other side Adriatic Sea. The distance by sea is hundreds of kilometers. Let's turn on the calculator again. To build giant wharves, millions of tons of stone were needed to pave squares and cover hundreds of palaces. Millions. Consider the weight of one block. It's not a brick that can be thrown into your hands. These are multi-ton blocks of cut stone. How they were loaded onto wooden medieval sailing ships. They had harbor cranes? Plumbing? Is it the mythical thousands of slaves and hemp ropes again? Loading a block weighing 5 or 10 tons onto a rickety wooden ship is an engineering task of the highest complexity even today. Shift the center of gravity 10 centimeters and the ship turns upside down. And they transported it in millions of tons without loss in storm conditions? This sounds like a fairy tale for good children, but the scariest thing is not even set in stone. Let's turn away from the water and look at the walls. What is Venice made of? Made of brick. Of the billions fired, red, clay bricks. And here begins the real production drama, which historians prefer not to notice. To produce one high-quality clinker brick that will last for centuries in the aggressive marine environment, you need clay, sand, water and, most importantly, fire. Furnaces are needed. Giant industrial furnaces, maintaining a temperature close to 1000 degrees Celsius for a long time. Now ask yourself a simple question. Where were these brickyards located? In a wooden city standing on stilts in the middle of the sea. Lighting a gigantic industrial fire in such conditions is madness. Any spark in the wind and Venice would have burned down completely while still at the foundation stage. So bricks were also transported. From where? From land. We're turning logistics back on. One standard brick weighs about 3 to 4 kilos. About 500,000 bricks, including load-bearing walls, are needed to build one modest 3-story palace. That's 2,000 tons of cargo for. There are thousands of buildings in Venice. We're talking about tens, hundreds, million tons of fired clay. Imagine the flotilla that had to transport it. This is not a merchant fleet. It's a continuous convoy of cargo barges, a pontoon bridge from lods that would have to operate for centuries. Without stopping for a minute. Where are the remains of these barges? Where are the port cranes for unloading? Where are the documents regarding the purchase of such a colossal amount of fuel for the furnaces? To burn this amount of clay, you would have to burn all of Europe's forests twice. But they tell us that it all happened by itself, quietly and unnoticed, by the forces of local craftsmen. This is an insult to our intelligence. Venice's stinkiest secret is its sewage system. Have you ever wondered where did the household waste of 1 or 200,000 people go in a city standing on the water in the Middle Ages? The official story is that everything simply flowed into the canals and the rising tides washed the dirt out to sea. Sounds simple. But this means that the Venetians literally lived on an open septic tank. Hydrogen sulfide fumes, putrefactive bacteria, plague. Under such conditions, life expectancy would have to be minimal and epidemics would not stop even for a day. The smell should be unbearable, killing every will to live. But Venice was flourishing. It was the center of fashion, art, perfumery, and luxury. The nobility wore velvet, she breathed the sea breeze and organized balls. They did not hold their noses against the stench of rotting waste under the windows. This is impossible if plumbing worked as primitively as historians tell us. There are diagrams of ancient tunnels and collectors under Venice, about which guidebooks are silent. It is an extremely complex engineering and hydro-technical system that could only function efficiently if the city originally stood on solid, dry ground. A gravity system that carried waste far outside the city. When the water rose, the system was breached and clogged, and the city had to urgently adapt to the new, tragic survival conditions. What about drinking water? Venice has no natural freshwater sources. There is a salty lagoon around. Where did 200,000 come from? Inhabitants and powerful industry, dye works and glass works used fresh water. They show us beautiful stone wells in the squares and say they are cisterns for collecting rainwater. A huge tank filled with sand for filtration was allegedly dug under each square. Sounds brilliant, ecological. But have you ever tried to water the metropolis with rainwater? Consumption volumes are huge. Drinking, cooking, laundry, horses, industry. Rains in Italy are abundant, but droughts occur regularly and last for months. Making your trade empire dependent on the whims of the weather is strategic suicide. No sensible ruler would take such a risk in building a capital city. Venetian wells are not only rainwater tanks. They're dummies. These are the outputs of an incredibly complex, perhaps an artesian pipe system whose technologies were lost or blocked by the disaster. Or it's the remains of infrastructure from the times when the city was part of the continent and had access to aqueducts. We only see the tip of the iceberg, decorative stone veneers, and come up with primitive explanations of their function because we don't understand how it really worked. There is a place in Venice that blows the brains out of any modern manufacturing engineer more effectively than bricks. It's an arsenal. Venetian arsenal. Officially, it is the first factory in the world with a production line. Legends tell us that in its heyday, 16,000 people worked there and were able to assemble and launch one finished war galley in one day. Think about it. One day. One fully equipped warship. Even Henry Ford with his assembly line in the 20th century, even today's nuclear shipyards, would envy such efficiency. Assemble an extremely complex wooden engineering structure, seal it, equip it with sails, rigging, guns, supplies, in 24 hours, in manual mode, without electricity, without screwdrivers, without slipping cranes, without numerically controlled machines. It's technically impossible. Physics doesn't allow it. Adhesives and sealants must dry. The wood must fit perfectly. There are two possibilities. Or technology was used in the arsenal that we are not allowed to know about. Advanced machines, robotics, unknown energy sources. Or these ships weren't built there at all. What if the Venetian arsenal was not a manufacturing shipyard, but a giant repair base? A warehouse for equipment left over from the previous and more developed civilization? Equipment that new life hosts, those who survived the cataclysm simply found it. They dug out the finished hulls from the mud, they patched them, repainted them and used them for their needs until the resources were exhausted. This explains their sudden dominance at sea. They were not brilliant sailors and shipbuilders. They simply found the god's garage and managed to get a few machines working. They were looters on the ruins of giants. And here we come to a demographic paradox that cannot be explained within the school history curriculum. The history of Venice and Europe in general is full of mentions of terrible epidemics. The Black Death mowed down half of the city's population. They tell us that the streets were strewn with corpses, that there was no one to bury the dead. The population dropped dramatically. And then? Literally several dozen years after the plague, we see a violent, unnatural growth of construction. Renaissance. Cathedrals are growing like mushrooms after rain. Who built them? Who gave birth to new workers? A woman can give birth to one child per year. To turn him into a stonemason, engineer, or shipbuilder, you also need something else: 15 to 20 years of education and growth. Human resources are renewed extremely slowly. The population math doesn't match the volume of work done. A catastrophic decline in population should be followed by a period of decline, destruction, regression, and emptiness lasting centuries. And we see the flowering of art and architecture on an unprecedented scale. It's unnatural. It's as if, after a nuclear war, a handful of survivors suddenly started building skyscrapers of glass and concrete instead of fighting over canned goods. Where did people come from? Or maybe they weren't exactly naturally born people? There is a terrifying theory that the population was artificially recreated. Recall strange paintings from that period, in which many babies were depicted, literally raised in some kind of capsules, glass vessels, or found in gardens, in cabbages or pumpkins. We laugh at it, we treat it as an allegory of fertility. What if it's not a metaphor? What if it's an instruction manual? Process documentation? What if after a global catastrophe that destroyed the previous civilization, the new owners of the Earth used cloning technologies or artificial incubators to quickly fill empty cities with labor? This would explain why our history seems so short and fragmented. Why don't we remember anything from 300 to 400 years ago? We, as a modern species, may have been launched quite recently. We are the descendants of those who were bred in test tubes to operate the surviving infrastructure. We are bio-robots that have forgotten our program. We look at Venetian masks and think that it's a carnival, a party. What if the mask is a symbol of impersonality? A symbol of the fact that there is no history beneath it, no memory, no individual soul, only a program? The Venetian aristocracy, the so-called black aristocracy, always kept to themselves. They had knowledge unavailable to commoners. They knew the secrets of navigation, banking and, above all, the production of glass and mirrors. Murano glass. It is associated with vases for tourists, but glass is more than that. These are optical technologies, lenses, mirrors, transparent materials of the highest purity. At a time when the rest of the world supposedly drank from clay cups and ate with their hands, perfect lenses were made in Venice. For what? Only for glasses? Or maybe for telescopes, precision surveying instruments, and perhaps laser weapons and light communications? The secrets of the Murano glassmakers were guarded under threat of death. Forbidden to leave the island. Why? Because it wasn't just a trade secret. This was the secret of the technology's origins. These were pieces of ancient knowledge that had to be preserved at all costs. Venice resembles a gigantic warehouse of surviving artifacts. A museum city that was conquered by barbarians who usurped its greatness but did not fully understand its operation. Look at the sculptures. For example, the famous marble veils, the most delicate fishing net carved from hard stone. Muscles visible under the transparent marble. Veins, skin pores. Modern CNC machines can barely replicate this. And they tell us that it was done by a master with a chisel and a hammer. Have you tried hitting marble with a hammer? It's a fragile material. One wrong move and everything falls to dust. Making a stone veil by hand is physically impossible. This requires stone softening technology, ultrasonic vibrations, or 3D printing with geopolymer paste. But to acknowledge this is to admit that we were relegated. That we are primitives compared to our ancestors. Now remember the year 1902. Campanile, bell tower of St. Mark. A great, mighty tower. Suddenly, on a clear day, it collapsed. But how did it collapse? It didn't fall on its side like a cut tree. She didn't slump to the side. She folded inwards. Carefully. Vertical. Like a controlled demolition with explosives, turning into a mountain of brick dust in seconds. Strange behavior for a building which supposedly simply deteriorated from old age, right? What if it was demolished on purpose? What if inside, at her core, discovered devices whose principles of operation they could not explain or wanted to hide from the world? What if the tower started emitting energy, vibrate and had to be turned off? Then it was quickly rebuilt. Just as it was. But perhaps without this technological interior. All we see is an empty shell. Cargo cult. We imitate the form, but we have lost the essence and function. We ring bells where atmospheric energy once rang, capable of levitating stones or transmitting electricity wirelessly. And this principle of imitation is visible in everything. Look at the sculpture of the winged lion in St. Mark's Square. It's a symbol of Venice. Officially, it is a medieval bronze cast. But when the statue was sent for restoration and a detailed spectral analysis was performed, scientists were amazed and horrified. The composition of the alloy turned out to be extremely complex, with admixtures of rare metals, which are difficult to obtain even in modern vacuum furnaces. Moreover, the style of the lion does not match European art of that period at all. It's a chimera. It's a biomechanical beast. Its wings look like aerodynamic elements, its joints like the hinges of a machine. It's more like an ancient machine Assyria or China or a robot. There is a version that it is not a statue, but a fossilized or metallized mechanism. Ancient drone, combat robot, a guard who was found in the ruins and placed on a column as a trophy, inventing a saint's name for him. Does it bother you that all of Venice is strewn with symbolism that we call mythical? Dragons, griffins, strange human-animal hybrids. We consider it an artist's fantasy. What if it's documentation? If before the disaster, before the world was flooded with mud and water, genetic engineering was an everyday occurrence? If these beings really lived among humans or were created by them as servants and then they got out of control? Then Venice turns from a romantic city into a laboratory of crazy geneticists whose experiments were washed away by the flood. And here comes the most terrible guess as to why Venice is sinking. They tell us global warming, melting glacier, land subsiding under weight, nonsense. The city is sinking because the mechanism whatever was keeping them afloat, whether it was anti-gravity, a force field, a vibration pad, or some other forgotten technology, stopped working. The battery is dead, the fuel is gone, the energy is gone. The heavy, stony mass that could once levitate or be stabilized by advanced systems began to obey the laws of brutal Newtonian physics, sinking into the mud. The poles themselves that historians throw in our faces may have been merely grounding electrodes, elements of a gigantic electrical circuit, or resonant stabilizing rods, rather than load-bearing structures. Who said Venice is just that? What do we see above the water? Remember how modern skyscrapers are built. The underground part is often as large as the above-ground part. If Venice is the top of the antediluvian metropolis, then entire floors, streets, tunnels are hidden underwater. Placed there, in the darkness and mud, lie the answers to all questions. There are real foundations there, which do not rot because they are not made of wood, but of materials whose names we do not even know. There may be preserved libraries, technology rooms, and warehouses of genetic material there. This is why diving in the canals is prohibited. Not because of the dirt, not because of the safety and traffic of the boat. But because any diver with a good flashlight could see it, it would destroy the official story in a second. He will see that the walls go down, not 2 meters, but 20, 50, 100 meters. That the windows stretch into the abyss. That the city is not at the bottom. It grows from the bottom, like a coral reef created by intelligent design. The thought makes me feel cold. We live in a world of total lies. We have been led to believe that we are the pinnacle of evolution. That we fly into space and created the iPhone. But we cannot even repeat the wall that was supposedly built in Venice in the mid-century. We cannot create a brick that will survive in salt water for 500 years without crumbling into sand. We have degraded. We are savages who live in an abandoned palace. They don't understand how heating works and burn precious parquet floors to keep warm. We look at Venice and think of caissons masquerades. And we should think about who lived here before us. Who were these giants of thought capable of turning a swamp into a paradise? Where did they go? They were erased, destroyed, and their homes were inhabited by us, small, obedient people with short memories and limited perception. We were given a false chronology. Fairy tales were invented about larch poles, refugees, and the great spice trade. All this so that we don't ask the most important question. Whose city is this really? And if they could build something like this, so who the hell destroyed their civilization? What force was able to defeat the builders of such fortresses? This enemy, this force that carried out the global reset, has not disappeared anywhere. She's here, she's watching us, by tourists' cameras, by satellites. It controls us so that we don't dig too deep. He makes sure that conservators smear joints made using unknown technologies with cement and replace the eternal stone with a cheap substitute that will fall apart in 50 years. The replacement takes place every day before our eyes. The original Venice disappears, dissolves, and is replaced by a paper model for tourists. Soon all that will remain is a postcard and a hazy memory. And then it will be impossible to prove the truth. We will be left alone with the lie, trapped in the matrix, from which there is no exit because we have forgotten that we are even in prison. Wake up, look at the water, it remembers everything.